Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are breaking down one of the most unexpected geopolitical surprises in recent Baltic Sea history, a moment that even Vladimir Putin never imagined would unfold the way it has. This situation has rapidly evolved into a strategic trap that is reshaping the balance of power in Northern Europe. The Baltic Sea, long considered a Russian gateway to Europe and the Arctic, is now turning into a zone of intense pressure, strategic choke points, and coordinated Western influence that has caught Moscow completely off guard. For years, the Kremlin relied heavily on the narrow sea routes cutting through the Baltic, believing that its military strength, naval presence, and political leverage over smaller nations would be enough to maintain dominance. But the last 2 years have proven that the geopolitical landscape can shift faster than traditional power structures can adapt. Moscow never truly expected that the Baltic coastline would become a highly coordinated ring of Western, aligned nations capable of applying pressure from every direction. The transformation was slow at first, but once Sweden and Finland made their NATO decisions, the entire map changed almost overnight. The Baltic region has always been a delicate environment, shaped by geography, trade, military interests, and historical rivalry. Russia's access to Kaliningrad, its isolated exclave, is critical for its naval capability. But as Europe strengthened its unity and NATO expanded its footprint, Moscow suddenly found itself boxed in by new military strategies that it didn't anticipate. This is where the trap begins. A trap formed not by a single move, but by a combination of diplomatic momentum, military coordination, and regional alliances that escalated quietly and then snapped shut all at once. Putin always believed he could control the Baltic narrative through intimidation, energy supply leverage, and calculated naval maneuvers. He assumed neighboring states would remain divided, hesitant, or neutral enough to prevent unified action against Russia. But the exact opposite happened. Russia's attempts to project power ended up pushing these nations closer together, forming a united front that became much stronger than Moscow thought possible. The trap was not set by NATO alone, it was set by Russia's own overconfidence. The moment Finland officially joined NATO, a massive shift took place. For years, Russia insisted that Finland would never cross that line. But after witnessing the situation in Eastern Europe, Helsinki realized that relying on neutrality was no longer an option. Finland's entry closed the northern gap of the Baltic region, extending NATO's influence across a long stretch of border directly adjacent to Russia. This shift stunned Moscow. It wasn't simply a political loss, it was a complete restructuring of regional military strategy. Suddenly, Russia's western flank was more exposed than ever before, and then came Sweden. Once Sweden moved toward NATO membership, the Baltic Sea underwent a full strategic transformation. With Sweden and Finland both aligned with NATO, the sea itself effectively became a Western, controlled zone. This is the heart of the trap. Russia now has only 2 meaningful access points to the Baltic, St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad, both vulnerable and heavily monitored. For a country that depends on maritime routes for military mobility, economic transport, and energy operations, this new reality is a nightmare scenario. Every route Russia once considered secure is now surrounded by advanced surveillance networks, air defense systems, and NATO naval patrols. The Baltic, once an area where Russia enjoyed selective leverage, has become a corridor of restrictions. Even Russian submarines face detection challenges that they didn't have before. Modern anti-submarine systems deployed by NATO members are creating a net that is increasingly difficult for Moscow to operate within. But the trap did not come from NATO membership alone. It came from the larger regional strategy of cooperation between the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These 3 small nations have amplified their roles in the geopolitical equation far beyond what Putin had expected. By coordinating intelligence sharing, defense systems, and strategic communication, they created a united bloc capable of applying pressure on Russia's movements around Kaliningrad. Russia always assumed these nations would remain vulnerable, but instead they have become strategic players in the region's defense architecture. Kaliningrad, once considered a powerful military outpost for Russia, is now effectively boxed in. Supply routes to Kaliningrad can be monitored, tracked, and potentially blocked under wartime scenarios. This encirclement was something Russia never believed Western nations could accomplish. But the steady increase in military exercises, the placement of missile defense systems, and enhanced naval readiness across the region have changed everything. Russia might still control the territory, but its freedom to use it as a strategic asset is diminishing rapidly. Another major element of this Baltic trap is infrastructure. Europe has been quietly building new energy routes, undersea cables, and transportation networks that bypass Russia entirely. One of Moscow's major sources of leverage has always been energy supply and pipeline access. But now that Europe is diversifying its energy routes and securing offshore infrastructure with advanced protective measures, Russia's influence is collapsing. Undersea surveillance systems now allow Western nations to monitor suspicious maritime activity in real time. This means pipeline sabotage, cable tapping, and covert naval operations are no longer easy for anyone, including Russia. The sea has become transparent. Russia's reliance on intimidation tactics in the region also backfired. Frequent airspace violations, naval exercises near NATO borders, and provocative maritime maneuvers did not scare nations into neutrality. They unified them. Each aggressive act created stronger cooperation, faster response protocols, and new shared defense agreements. The very actions intended to weaken NATO engagement ended up reinforcing it. This self-created pressure is one of the reasons analysts refer to the situation as a trap. It wasn't set deliberately by Western nations. It was constructed piece by Russia's own decisions. Trade routes across the Baltic Sea also played a huge role in shaping this trap. The Baltic is an economic lifeline for countries that rely heavily on ports for international commerce. When Russia began interfering with shipping routes and signaling potential blockades, the European Union responded with a long-term strategy of securing the region with patrol fleets, satellite monitoring, and logistical support for commercial vessels. Moscow never expected the EU to invest so heavily in maritime security, but the investment paid off. The Baltic is now one of the most heavily monitored maritime environments in the world. Every vessel movement can be tracked and authenticated. This greatly reduces Russia's room for covert activity. Another factor in this geopolitical trap is information warfare. Russia has long used disinformation tactics to influence political structures in neighboring states. But after multiple attempts, European nations hardened their information systems, strengthened cybersecurity protocols, and launched rapid response mechanisms against false narratives. Russia gradually lost its ability to manipulate Baltic politics. Instead of destabilizing these nations, Russia's efforts only made them more alert and more resistant. Information warfare that once gave Moscow an edge is now pushing countries further into Western cooperation. The Baltic Sea has also become a testing ground for advanced technology. NATO members are deploying new drones, underwater detection systems, and artificial intelligence-based monitoring platforms. These systems provide real-time data that was unimaginable a decade ago. Russia's traditional military tactics are now being matched by advanced digital surveillance that makes surprise maneuvers nearly impossible. Putin likely never expected that his Baltic operations would be countered by such cutting-edge systems. The technological gap is widening, and Moscow is struggling to keep up. Russia's naval fleet in the Baltic, which once held symbolic and strategic power, is now overshadowed by NATO's combined maritime forces. Western nations have invested in faster ships, more precise missile systems, and modernized air defense platforms that cover the entire sea. The idea of the Baltic being a Russian-dominated region has become outdated. Even Russia's strongest warships face overwhelming surveillance, making their positions predictable and their actions manageable by NATO forces. One of the most surprising developments is the alignment between Poland and the Baltic states. Poland has rapidly expanded its military capability and become a major hub for NATO's Eastern defense strategy. This wasn't something Putin anticipated. He underestimated Poland's long-term commitment to regional security. But now Poland plays a critical role in reinforcing Baltic defense, creating an Eastern front partnership that severely limits Russia's ability to project power westward. The economic isolation Russia faces due to sanctions has weakened its ability to maintain an active and modern naval program. Budget constraints, international restrictions, and supply shortages have slowed Russia's military modernization. Meanwhile, NATO states continue upgrading their fleets. The longer this imbalance continues, the more difficult it becomes for Russia to compete in the Baltic Sea. Another element of the trap is diplomatic pressure. Russia once held significant diplomatic influence in Northern Europe, but after recent events, that influence crumbled. Europe's unity has strengthened dramatically, leaving Russia with fewer political allies and fewer negotiation options. Even countries that once maintained a careful balance with Russia have shifted towards stronger Western alignment. Diplomatically, Russia is now isolated in a region where it once had leverage. At the heart of this geopolitical trap is geography. The Baltic Sea is surrounded almost entirely by NATO-aligned countries. Russia holds only a small percentage of the coastline. This geographic disadvantage has always existed, but it never mattered as much as it does today because the surrounding nations were not as unified or strategically aligned as they are now. Russia is discovering that even a small geographical weakness can become a major vulnerability when political and military alliances strengthen around it. This new environment means that any Russian action in the Baltic must be carefully calculated. Missteps could trigger broader consequences. Moscow no longer has the luxury of operating freely. Every movement is observed, analyzed, and matched by Western countermeasures. The Baltic is now a chessboard where Russia has fewer moves and fewer pieces than it once believed. As Russia faces these challenges, it is becoming clear that the Baltic Sea has transformed into a strategic choke point, one controlled largely by its rivals. This is not a position Putin ever expected Russia to be in. The rapid changes in geopolitical alignment, military strategy, and technological capability have reshaped the region into a controlled zone that limits Russia's influence. Even Russia's energy strategy in the Baltic has weakened. Projects like Nord Stream once gave Moscow enormous leverage, but after recent events, Europe has accelerated its shift away from Russian energy dependence. New infrastructure projects ensure that the Baltic region is no longer vulnerable to energy pressure from Moscow. This reduces one of Russia's most powerful historic tools. The situation continues to evolve. Each year, NATO strengthens its presence. Each year, Russia's access and maneuverability shrink. And each year, the trap tightens. Putin never expected the Baltic Sea to become a strategic disadvantage, but now it has become one of his biggest geopolitical weaknesses. The region he once relied on for leverage has become a zone of containment. The Baltic Sea trap is not a single moment or a single event. It is a chain reaction created by alliances, strategic decisions, regional cooperation, and technological advancement. Russia underestimated all of these factors, and now it is facing the consequences. The geopolitical board has changed, and Moscow must navigate a new reality where its influence is limited. Its routes are monitored, and its rivals are unified in ways it never expected. The transformation of the Baltic region stands as a powerful example of how strategic environments can shift dramatically over time. It shows how nations can reshape their security through cooperation and shared goals. And it reveals how overconfidence can blind even powerful countries to major strategic changes happening around them. As the Baltic continues to strengthen its defenses and expand its strategic partnerships, Russia's options will narrow further. The trap is set. The question now is how Russia will respond in the coming years as the region becomes more fortified, more technologically advanced, and more unified than ever before. Whatever happens next, one thing is clear. Putin never expected the Baltic Sea to become one of the greatest strategic challenges of his geopolitical career.